Let's get on to what we're here to talk about, which is creative entrepreneurship. All of these people have a really interesting story to tell, and I can't wait for you to hear it. And as we go through the journey, think about through the story, think about what kind of questions you want to ask them, because there'll be some Q&A time towards the end as well. And the purpose of this is just to inspire, if you're a creative, to inspire you to think about what sort of business model you could apply to your craft to create something that is a standalone business outside of renting out your time. But also, I think there's so much we can learn from creative entrepreneurs for any kind of business. And I'm really excited to share that with you today. And our host of the conversation is creative entrepreneur Sara Taiyo, co-founder of Drift Media. I'm going to hand this over to you.
Hey everyone, good to be here tonight. Good to see you all. A little background on myself. So myself and founding partner Abdi is in the crowd over there taking a couple of snaps today. We kind of set up Drift Time 6 years ago now. We're a digital design and impact agency that works at the intersection of purpose and intention. And we're working with brands that are looking to create impact in large ways. Cool. I will also ask each of you to introduce yourselves. So Marcus, do you want to kick us off?
Okay, so I'm Marcus. I'll tell you a little bit about my story, about how I came to do what I do. So always been musical, played piano since I was a kid, 7 or 8 years old. It was always my thing, it was my passion. Moved through school and got to the point where everybody was moving off to university. They all seemed super sure about what they were going to do, and I didn't necessarily have any idea what I wanted to do. All I knew was that I liked playing the piano and I liked art. Flicking through a university prospectus, and I saw a degree for commercial composition and music tech. And this explained that people were writing music for TV adverts, radio adverts, and getting paid for it, which I thought sounded awesome. So I went to uni and I did that. And this is where I kind of found my passion for orchestral music in the form of film scores. And I also learned that people were writing this orchestral music on computers, which blew my mind. So as soon as I found out that I could press a key and the sound of a violin would come out or a flute would come out, I was hooked. And so moving through university, I got a decent mark, and I rather naively came out thinking I was going to fall into a job, and that was not the case. It was that kind of situation where, I needed the experience to get a job, or the job to get the experience, and so I did anything and everything I could to sort of get my foot in the door in the industry. I did a whole bunch of things, but one noteworthy thing is I did an internship, worked for free in London for a music production company, and essentially what they were doing was they were creating compilation albums, and they were doing sound-alikes, so as close to the original as possible, putting them in a compilation album, and then selling these things. And I remember when I was there, I was thinking, well, why are we doing this if people can just go and listen to the original? Like, what are we offering that's new? So I put a pin in that. I finished my internship there. It was kind of back to square one a little bit. And it was around this sort of time that I realized that people were writing orchestral music, but for video games. And I should also know that I'm a big video game fan. Been playing video games probably longer than I've been playing the piano, and I still do. So once I realized this, I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to write music for video games. Again, super competitive landscape, really tough to get your foot in the door. And so I was sat down one day, I was on YouTube, I was listening to some music from these games that I played from my childhood, one in particular called Zelda. And, this is like, it was super nostalgic, super comforting, and that gave me an idea. And so what I thought I would do is I would kind of breathe some new life into these tracks that from back in the day, and I thought, well, it would be a great way for me to build my portfolio. It would be a great way for me to, improve as a composer. And so, I started doing that. I did my first album, I got it licensed, and I put it out there, and a couple months later, sitting back, waiting for the money to roll in, and I earned, it was $11, I think, my first one. But I carried on doing it because I enjoyed it. It was super fun. But a couple more months went by, and I earned considerably more. And that's when I was like, I'm onto something here. So, this was 10 years ago now, and I have been doing it ever since. Those covers I've been doing, I did Super Mario, I did Sonic, I did all these things. It did end up getting me my first video game gig, and I write original music for games now. I ended up calling it the Trend Orchestra, and so my arrangements, my covers, I think I just passed 106 million streams on Spotify, and that's my story, essentially.
Thanks, Marcus.
No worries.
Ben, ask the same about you, just your intro to your story and where you are
So
today.
I initially thought I was going to be a professional show jumper. That didn't really turn out that well. Then I thought, right, I'm going to be a professional sailor. I was convinced that sport was my thing, realised I wasn't that good at either of them. And somewhere along the line, someone suggested to me, well, most sports are on TV, so why don't you go and use that expertise you've got in the sports, but make TV? So I thought, that's not a bad idea. So I went to university and studied television production, and then came out of it, and my first job, I was like, I've got to work in sports. That's what I love. And freelanced in sports broadcasting for 10 years in total, and just kind of did as many roles as I could. I figured out quite early that I wanted to make my way to the top. I wanted to be a director in sports broadcasting. And I figured the best way to get there was to kind of mingle around, do lots of different bits. And then eventually, maybe I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, I met my now wife, who was running a small marketing agency in Helsinki, and I convinced her that she should move to London and come and live with me. And she said, fine, but I'm only going to do this if you're going to really push what you're doing and become the best. I'm going to give up my life, so I want you to commit. I think she wanted some financial security from me. And I went all out. Unfortunately, that timed really well with COVID, and all sports stopped. And she said to me, Ben, this is a chance for you to do something different. So the marketing for her was a way of expressing her business interest. And so she said, look, I don't care what we do. I just want to run a business. Why don't we run a video production company? And I said, it's not that easy. She said, look, you've been working for these people for 10 years. Okay, admittedly, the last 2 years I've been in a more senior role. These people have been profiting off of your leadership and your skills. So surely you can take that and do it yourself. She worded it a bit better than I did then, and I was convinced. And so, kind of went at it during COVID, which was definitely a tough time for doing things, but also there was a bit of a reset button happening in the industry. Suddenly everything was done online. All these events like this where we are now, that was all online, and perhaps bigger conferences with hundreds of people were turning to broadcasting. So I thought, okay, maybe it doesn't have to be sport to start with. And things just sort of organically grew really through that, and I ended up sort of using some old freelance contacts. in the sports industry and pinching a few jobs off of some old clients of mine. But ultimately, we're now at a place, we've got a small team. Paul is there, one of the team, and the dog who barked earlier. And yeah, kind of growing, still working in some sports stuff. But I think I learned very quickly that the thing you love isn't always the thing that makes you the money. So we tend to do quite a few corporate bits, which can be a bit boring. But yeah, ultimately always trying to do sports work because that's where the fun is for me.
Thank you. Sarah, how about yourself?
Hi, I'm Sara. It's really fun speaking here, especially because this is the site of my first ever performance when I was younger. I think I was like 14 and got to play the snowman on the flute at our school Christmas performance. So I'm from Brighton originally, clearly. But yeah, so I didn't think that I was allowed to be creative. I didn't really understand creativity at school because they would like mark you and tell you if your drawing was good or not. So I decided to become an anthropologist instead. And then it was just as I was graduating that my dad passed away. He died very quickly of pancreatic cancer. I got a job very temporarily working in the NHS. In referral management, which is so interesting because you get to read everyone's medical records. And people have a lot of weird things that happen to them. And it was kind of like these insights into people's lives and their stories. But I got a bit bored and felt very clock-watchy and just waiting for the weekend. And it was then that I got offered a job at Fabrica Gallery in Brighton. And initially, I was an invigilator, and I was just standing in the space, just talking to people about what these artworks meant to them. And it was this amazing exhibition called The Blue Route that was all about grief and loss. And I was like, oh my God, this is so interesting. Like, you can use art as a way of talking about really difficult experiences, and that actually it's just a catalyst to conversation. So I worked there for a little bit, and then I moved over to Lighthouse, which are a sort of digital arts agency, and I worked with them in their film department and did a lot of things around music and storytelling. We used to run a conference called The Sound of Story. And then it was around that time that I got quite ill, and I think I just didn't really deal with grief very well, and had what was later described as a psychotic episode. And so I was sitting over in Millview being kind of offered antipsychotics and being like, I don't think this is actually what I need. I think I just need a hug. And it was there that I became really interested in the doctor's office as a performance space and how we have such a limited time to tell our stories. And I felt really unheard in that moment. So skip forward some amount of time, and I became really interested in virtual reality as this kind of fascinating tool where you could kind of put somebody in the position of somebody else. And so I initially approached it as a storytelling tool. How could I make a virtual reality experience about what it's like to have a mental health condition? And then I moved out to Australia and started getting involved in the VR space out there, and discovered how VR was used not just as a storytelling tool, not just as a gaming experience, but how it's also being used to improve mental health as well. So I became a curator at the Big Anxiety Festival, that was an arts and mental health festival, and showed a range of experiences that were talking about mental health, and also showed an experience that I'm now part of called Deep, which is a breath-controlled virtual reality experience where you move through this magical underwater world controlled entirely by your breath. And it was developed between artists and scientists. They're very much artist-led, but backed by science. We had a PhD researcher that did her entire PhD on the experience, but it's been taken to film festivals, it's got permanent installations in galleries around the world. We're now publishing it as an art experience, but also bringing it into hospitals and doing research on how it can support people with long COVID, support people in palliative care. We're making a spooky Deep version for children with PTSD, where we're putting these sort of putting them in triggering environments and teaching them how to sort of manage their anxiety through slow, deep breathing. So I kind of, have been involved in that the last few years, but had my own idea for a project called Hatsumi, which means to see something for the first time. And that was going to be my PhD, and then I didn't get onto the PhD. And then I tried to do another PhD, and that didn't work out, and it turned out I'd accidentally, illegally been working in America, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, Hatsumi is an adaptation of a form of art therapy called body mapping, where traditionally what you would do is trace around your body on a large piece of paper and go through a mindfulness experience and think, where do I feel anxiety in my body? Do I feel it in my chest? Like, is it deep in your stomach? And does it have like a colour or a texture? And how could you sort of non-verbally articulate that? But I'm an anthropologist administrator at this point, not an artist, and was really underwhelmed by the experience and have been working in VR for a while. And I was like, how do we make this spatial? And so we've been developing it as a virtual reality experience where you have a 3D body that you start by being embodied within, and then you step out of it and it becomes this 3D canvas that you can illustrate on. So we're working again with scientists and researchers and patients with lived experience to think, how do we create different tool sets? How do you get to paint with fire and electricity and paint spatially with sound to create these artworks that can be brought to public spaces, so galleries and museums, and how we can have these artworks come together to create a terracotta army of pain, but also how it can be taken back into those doctors' offices as a way of enabling patients to better articulate themselves, and how can doctors better diagnose and understand patients through that as well. So again, a very artist-led but science-backed approach as well. I feel like I've been talking for ages. I'm just going to talk briefly about two other things that I do, because I am a fractional founder, enjoying this. But yeah, through that, I started speaking to people in the NHS when I was first like, okay, I think I'm going to start this up as a company. But how do you do this? Can I get funding from the art world and the science world? Like, how does it work? And then spoke to other people that were bringing VR experiences into the NHS, and they were like, don't bother, like, this isn't really happening. So I'm also the co-founder now of something called the XR Health Alliance, and we've been working with the NHS and government to create a national strategy for VR in healthcare. So how we bring together artists and scientists to co-create VR experiences that can be potentially prescribed in the future as well. So I'm really proud that as of last week, the government have just announced a £24 million fund to support VR experiences for mental health, and how we can start working with the games industry as well. And then do some stuff with like music and AR on the side.
Very cool. That's cool. It kind of blends in quite nicely, but I think everyone's doing such different expressions of what creativity is for all of you. And I'd love to kind of hear a bit more. I know, like, you just mentioned we, and it's kind of, I'd love to hear a bit more about like who you're working with, and similarly that you're working with your wife. I'll start with you, Marcus, as you were first to go. But how do you think about kind of scaling what you do, if you do, at the moment? And is it just yourself working on this, or do you have other people who have kind of over the years started working with you to realise what it is that you do?
I think it's scalable in a couple of ways. I mean, as soon as I do a track, it's done. It's a product. It's out there to go and do its thing. So you could look at it from the perspective of track output. I could potentially hire another composer and train them to do similarly to what I do. I think creatively, every composer is different. Everybody has a different style, a different voice. So I'm kind of integral to the business from that standpoint. But, scalability, I guess, can mean different things. I haven't explored the merch side of things. It's something that I should probably do at some point, but I haven't done that yet. That's something I'm considering. And then as far as I can only speak from a composer standpoint, but you build a team around you essentially of people that help do the things that you aren't necessarily a specialist in. John in the audience there does my mastering for me, and he has done for years, and that's he's essentially a part of my business. Whenever I have a roster of musicians that I get to do, tracking for me. If I need a flute done, I have a flautist. If I need a violin done, I get a violinist. So yeah, I mean, I have built a team around me in that sense, and that will only grow as my projects grow.
How do those relationships come about?
Quite often through recommendation. I mean, I met John, actually. I was writing music for a music software company, actually based in Brighton, and John was doing some mastering with them, and we met through that. Same with musicians. It's like you kind of put it out there into the universe, and you're like, well, do any of you guys know somebody who plays guitar really well? And more often than not, a lot of people will be like, yeah, you should, speak to my mate Dan. He's great, and that's essentially that's how those things come about. And over the years, I've kind of got a little black book of people that I work with. So yeah, it's good.
Do you want to speak a little bit more to that idea of, again, with music, that it's almost you've got an end result that's a product? Because obviously some creative services that they're kind of like in-life experiences, so you can't necessarily have that kind of thing that you could pay for once and then you own it, or purchasable thing. But are you quite mindful of that when you're creating, again, about like how do you get that balance between like living well and loving what you're doing?
Yeah, I think I'm very fortunate in the way that I am my target market. So I enjoy it, and a lot of the time I'm putting myself in their shoes and thinking, well, I like this. There's a good chance that my followers and listeners are gonna like it also. At first, I was super keen to get as many out as I could. Now I'm much more about quality over quantity, because I quickly realized that once I've done one of these arrangements, once I've done one of these covers, it's done then. I can't really do it again, not in the same way, at least. So, now I sort of slowed it down a bit and focusing on the long game, because what I'll often do is I'll promote something that I've done a year ago, and I want to be proud of that still then. I'm slowing it down, taking my time with them, That's all right.
And just to add to that really quickly as well, because I think this is such an interesting distinction between like working the creative industry sometimes and working more in the startup world, is that I think with more creative work, you only launch once, you only publish once, rather than often with products, then there's a real kind of push to like get it out there as quickly as possible, just get early customers and early revenue and blah, 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 rather than, with these kind of things, then like, you get judged on it, right?
For sure. There is a underlying sense of pressure where, we're constantly digesting content, right? And, like the internet shows you everybody that's sharing all their stuff all over the world all at once. And it's really tough to sort of take a breath and be like, right, I'm just going to focus on finishing this and getting it to a standard that I'm pleased with, and not be like, I want to put it out in the universe. I want, because everybody else is doing stuff and I want to get it out there. So it's a good point.
Yeah. And then the whole artist brain of like, is this good enough?
Oh, yeah.
Is this ever good enough? Which is also very hard.
Yes.
Would you all say that you're kind of the stance of feeling more confident to just get it out quickly, or you're more precious to hold on to it?
I'm precious for sure. Yeah. Forever saying, can I make this a little bit better? As John knows all too well.
I find the worst thing in that space is when you've got it to where you think it's absolutely perfect. Most of our work is for clients rather than direct to the public, and then you send it to the client. You're like, smug look on your face, and they go, no. Yeah, and maybe not like a big no, but change it little bits, and you end up changing things that you think are so fundamental to it. I guess that's a difference working, content for a client or for mass or for your own public.
Have you, over time, got any processes that you practice now to push back on those things again when you really feel like it's right and that the client might be wrong or like harming their own image or self by keeping it?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of pulled it back to the earlier in the process. So because Kate, who's my wife and business partner, is into the business side of things more, and I guess from her marketing background about understanding like business objectives means that we always come back to that. So if there's a big decision to be made, we go, okay, let's just check back at what that first conversation we had was. That's the correct answer. And then if the client then says, actually, no, I think we should go the other way, we say, just so you know, it's that way because of that initial conversation we had. And then, yeah, like you said, sometimes they then go, oh, okay, yeah, sorry, you're right. That's a good feeling.
Yeah, that's cool. Sarah, you mentioned that, like, you know, there's a lot of things going on. You've got lots of different ventures and things. How do you choose where to invest your time and energy? Because there's only so much time.
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it's so interesting, like the weird natural flow of how work unfolds sometimes. Like I feel like especially in that like freelance life, and then it's either like I'm so busy and so overwhelmed, or no work has come in and I'm just going to starve. And then suddenly the next day like something appears. And I kind of feel like with all the different things that I work on, there has just been like this natural flow of there are moments where certain things perhaps take a little bit more energy rather than other things like perhaps are a little bit slower at that point. But also I think just having an amazing team around you as well, and like the gentle art of delegating and working with different people. Because yeah, all these things have been quite separate for quite a while, all the different projects, but actually after a while we had this conversation of all my different collaborators and different projects, and we were like, we're all just doing the same thing, aren't we? We're all making sort of, yeah, science-driven VR experiences with art at the heart of it, and I'm kind of selling one thing into somewhere, but also kind of like selling your thing in and our thing in, and aren't we all the same but have different forms of expertise? So we're now kind of in this process of actually creating a parent company now that will house all these different experiences under and actually bring everyone under the same roof, so that actually we can be smarter with our time as well, and we just have our sort of in-house scientists that will lead on everything, and then our sort of creative team or whatever. So but it's definitely a process, and there are definitely moments where I felt really overstretched, and then moments where I'm like, it's the summer and we've been in lockdown for 2 years, so I'm just going to have a month off, and that's okay, because it's all happening slowly but surely. And I think also working in the sort of VR industry as well, then there is a little bit of like sometimes playing the waiting game, and I think some people have sort of acknowledged the value of our work, but other people like the NHS have taken a long time to be like, oh, maybe we could actually like use VR in our facilities. And so I think a little bit of patience has
Does it
paid off.
take you showing them an example? Like, I know that, you know, there's some scenarios where somebody won't like appreciate it or know or like understand it until you actually show them. Did you find that with the NHS?
Oh my God, 100%. It's a really good Frank Zappa quote. It's like, talking about music is like dancing to architecture. And I think it's the same thing about VR, because you just see people like looking a bit silly with a headset on and kind of like flailing around and like, sorry, what? And then you put people in, and I think this is why I'm so fascinated by it, how this weird technology can like profoundly change you and create these sort of playful states and moments of like awe and wonder and connection. And so the way that the technology is developing, that now you can just put a headset in your backpack, you don't need wires and towers, and that you can just go into these places and say, hey everyone, do you want to try some really cool stuff? And it's just like my favorite thing to do, because you just see people like really get it, and they go, oh my God, we would love to bring this into this department, or we can really see how this could be used during chemotherapy or during sort of small procedures where people are really anxious. And so I think that has gotten small buy-in. But then the other work they've been doing with the XR Health Alliance is going, well, all these little hospitals around the country and trusts are investing in this stuff, but it's little pockets and they're very unconnected. So how do we get them to sort of commit at scale? And that's where you need to do numbers and health economics and really sort of present the data. So that's what we did last year, and released this big report that has now led to this other work unfolding.
Ben, you're team of yourself and your wife, and you mentioned a few other people in the room also who you're working with. It sounds like you work a fair bit with like freelancers who then build into your team. How does that model work for you? Do you have any nerves ever about freelancers not being available when projects come up and things like that?
That last point about freelancers not being available, yeah. Recently, especially the government campaign during COVID was creative people should retrain into something engineering or technical, right? Which was ridiculous. Yeah, it definitely is a worry, especially because we've just finished putting together a pitch for the Premiership Women's Rugby. And it's a massive contract, and we're a team of 6 people in the office. Like, we definitely can't deliver it. We're based here in Brighton. It's, we need to take in people kind of all over the country for it. And yeah, if we win it, fingers crossed when we win it, there's suddenly a massive load of freelancers we need to suck up. And I still do a bit of freelancing, so I know that there's a lack of them out there. But I think it's to that point that Marcus said earlier. I'm really nervous about using somebody who I don't know personally, or that hasn't come from recommendation from somebody who I trust. I think for a staff role, I feel more comfortable about just sending out a job advert, because they're going to be with you for a long time and you get to know them and trust them. Yeah, whereas with freelancers, it's definitely more difficult. Sometimes I think you just have to trust people.
Are you of the mindset of working with both freelancers and kind of employing people internally, or I don't know whether you like sway either way? And again, I'm sure some roles maybe don't warrant having kind of somebody who will be part-time or full-time.
If it was possible, I think the old me, if it was possible, I would have said freelance everywhere, because that was I used to be a freelancer, and I was like, it just makes sense. And then the more I sort of learnt about business from my wife, it was like, oh yeah, if you have a member of staff, suddenly, yes, there's like that scary thing that you have to pay them regardless of how much work you get, but also you can make money on them, but also you can develop them, and someone comes in with a great piece of skill that they can bring to you, and then you can also apply your skill and your knowledge onto them. So I think now I've basically gone 180 now. I just think everyone, if we could afford to have staff for every single role, it would be brilliant. So I guess, when the money allows.
Cool, yeah. I know something for us when we're hiring, then it's very much kind of looking for who the person is rather than necessarily the skills that they've got. Because I think, as you say, a lot of that you can kind of, you can teach whatever the things are. But again, you kind of want that passion or entrepreneurial spirit or whatever it is, again, that's kind of ingrained within what you're doing. You can't teach that.
I think that's the difference between staff and freelance, right? If it's freelance, you want someone who's going to come in for one day and do a perfect job. Whereas if it's staff, for example, we took on an editor who was part of the Kickstart scheme, and his editing experience was really quite limited. And he didn't even join us as an editor. Now he's editing stuff that we do for Aston Martin, and it's mad. And he looks back at it, he's like, this is crazy. What am I doing here? But because he had such a deep passion to learn, he said, look, this is my skill set, but I've learned this over the last 12 months. Imagine what I could do in another 12 months. And we were like, yeah. I gave him a go. And I guess that was the really nice thing about that Kickstart scheme, that if somebody came at you with that attitude, you could say, okay, here's 6 months to prove yourself. And he did.
And I think it's really interesting seeing like opportunities like this coming up, which I think is encouraging people to work with perhaps people that they wouldn't have done otherwise, because I think there is often a real danger in hiring the people you know, because circles are quite small. And I think that when we go by that sort of friendship recommendation thing, then we end up working with people that look and sound like us. And I think that the success of companies are often down to the diversity of the people within it. And I think when you're, kind of working to short timelines and small budgets, then it's really easy to go, oh, let's invite James to work with us again because we know him, whatever. But then after a while, I know I've been in positions where I've kind of like looked at all the freelancers I've worked with and been like, it's a lot of white men. And I think it's really important to remember that we need to work with more diverse people, because it also changes the outcomes of the project, and the organisations are more creative when you have all those different people from different backgrounds and different perspectives involved. And I think it's interesting with the work that we're getting into now, that we have to show procurement to people that we work with more, and that there is like a tendering process, and actually we are now being forced to demonstrate our decision-making process from a sort of financial perspective. But I'm really glad that we're being held accountable now as well to who we work with, and that it's taken us a moment to take a step back and go, okay, let's rethink who we bring in, especially when it comes to co-creation, that a lot of the work we're doing is meant to be about things that are available for everyone. So I think inviting a range of people into that creation process is important.
I know, Sarah, earlier you mentioned about that there seems to be a bit of a coming together of a collective of different people now under one umbrella. Kind of two-part question. One is, has diversity within that group of people been kind of an important aspect? And the other is, like, how's it gone with, are you all founders that are coming together to be one company? Or, yeah, how does it work?
How does it work? Well, yeah, it's a real range of people, but yeah, most of the people I work with are actually based in the Netherlands, and so yeah, our partners, our co-creators, I guess, are another company called Monobanda that have been doing work in interactive theatre and play and health for quite a long time as well. So it started that I was working with them on Deep, and then they had Joannika, who's the PhD student who is based within Radboud University and the Games for Emotional Mental Health Lab, and doing her PhD with them on the game that we were co-creating with them. And then she graduated and now works in Monobanda internally. And so working with them, I was initially the producer on Deep, and now Nikki, who's the director of Monobanda, this is very complicated, is now my co-director. But yeah, we're all kind of like finding our way, and I think it's a lot of like stumbling in through the dark and working out how to collaborate on this. Also through lots of the consulting work that I've done over the years, which is how I've survived, I guess, and I've met a lot of collaborators on the way through that research. And so it is chaotic a little bit, but I think now we're starting to work together on all these different projects and realise that we all do bring different skill sets from a creative or producing perspective. And so there's a core team of us that have expertise across the business, the art, the research, but then have a whole range of freelancers that we're now planning to bring in more full-time as well. But I think, yeah, through doing new projects together, we're starting to see our blind spots of who we need to bring in. So it's very much a work in progress.
Marcus, you're working kind of, again, within the gaming space because of that being like hobby area and, again, like music that you're making. Has the gaming community played any part in who you work with?
In what sense? In like from?
I guess from when you're putting things out, is it kind of a great source then of the people in the community that will receive it, that they kind of all touch base with you, and maybe you've met people who you've collaborated with via gaming?
So, I mean, the good thing about obviously having things like, I mean, if I'm interpreting this properly, as far as YouTube's concerned, social media, etc., I get a lot of feedback from those guys that are passionate about the things that I put out there, and that can often dictate what I choose to do next. You know, what direction I take with my next project. As far as collaborators are concerned, I mean, again, like I said earlier, so the first video game gig that I landed, original soundtrack, you know, this was maybe like four or 5 years ago now, but the game had been likened to Zelda, and I'd just done a big Zelda cover album, so it was the perfect segue. And they were like, "Oh, we absolutely love Zelda." And I was like, "You know what? I've just done a big Zelda album. You know, do you need music for your game?" And they were like, "This sounds really cool. Do you want to pitch?" I was like, "Yes." and the rest is kind of history from there. But so yeah, it kind of opens some, as far as potential people to work with the gaming community, game devs, etc., etc. Yeah, like absolutely. Thanks.
And can I ask as well, so there's a huge gaming industry in Brighton, right? Like, do you collaborate a lot with people locally, or is it more international?
Yeah, weirdly, like, not yet. A little bit. I don't know if you know Frontier Developments. I worked with those guys recently. Worked with quite a few people from Europe, actually. But it's pretty thriving here in terms of socials and stuff. Silicon Brighton's done a few networking events and bits and bobs that I've been to. There's, everybody's super friendly, super welcoming, and super eager to work together as well. And now we're out the other side of COVID. I think that, I know that I'm taking full advantage of these things. So, yeah.
Ben, you mentioned earlier, before we were sat here, about for women's rugby, that you were keen to have a larger female team. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that within your industry and finding women to work with?
Yeah, so the broadcasting industry is massively male dominated, so from the top executive levels down to runners. And this was a project. So it was women's sport, and we're a company so Kate is the CEO, and the co-founder is a woman. And we thought, surely this has got to be one of the few times we can play to the strengths of that within broadcasting. And that it was part of our pitch, and we made a commitment to be 50% female team. And I'm still not sure how we're going to do it if we get the project. It's definitely going to be tough, but I think that level of commitment hopefully is understood, and they can look at that as a real strong value. I don't know if it's at the place where it's something you can a lot of people put in and say diversity, tick the box. It was something we were discussing earlier with I can't remember the name of the organisation that you're affiliated to.
Oh, B Corp.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's one something without something, and in the broadcasting industry that I'm aware of, there's something for environmental sustainability, but when it comes to social sustainability, there's no industry recognised accreditation you can get, and so people are just saying, yeah, we're diverse. There's a lady somewhere here, and there's someone who's not a white British man here. And it's interesting, we didn't actually pitch it by saying, actually, we're going to be 50% females. We went for, we said, look, this is women's sport. You're putting women's sport up there along with the men's sport they're putting it on BBC, and they're putting a lot of money into it. And we said, if you really believe in promoting in diversity and pushing women to the front of sport, then that shouldn't just be in sport. You should want to do that in broadcasting. So in broadcasting, it's a similar issue to sport, that women are underrepresented. So choose us, because we're also doing that. So I think it was taking a bit of a moral high ground with them and sort of challenging them on that was the way to add it into our pitch. So Kate was obviously there at the pitch, and it was quite ironic. It was only originally going to be me and the two people from the RFU rugby, and it was two men and me, and she came in, and her open line was, well, thank fuck I'm here, otherwise it'd be three men talking about women's sport. But it's so common, right? And there are other companies out there. I know the company that do the Women's Super League, which is the Premier League for women, and there's three company founders and directors, and they're all men. Yet somehow they won that contract. And I'm sure they've got a diverse team, but there's a lot of men in the senior roles there.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. I'd love to close out on kind of how creativity has empowered or enabled your business, and then flip side it of how it's been a hindrance for you in creating a business and making it run smoothly from day to day. Does anyone want to volunteer to go first on?
Yeah, I've got an idea. My tongue. I think when I made the switch to being freelancing to business, the big objection I had was the sales. And my wife said to me, don't think about sales as being traditional sales. You love being creative, so think about creative ways of doing sales. So two quite fun ways we came up with. One was our expertise are in video, so why not do video pitches? And, everyone else is sending a deck, we send a video. And the other idea was to attract potential clients. Also, we only moved to Brighton at the start of COVID, so to also meet people around here, we started doing a podcast. So again, that was a creative way of pitching, or of, at least getting to meet people who we might be able to do business with. I met Sarah on that podcast, and that was just a way of meeting other people doing fun and creative things.
What's your podcast called?
Surpass Your Potential, but there hasn't been one for a while. It's it's fallen off a little bit. But there's some good ones out there, especially the Sarah's one. The hindrance, I think, has been that anything creative, I think the three of us can all say the same, that you put your heart and soul into something creative, which isn't to say that you don't do that with any other business, but I think you've got one product that you're perfecting for weeks, months, and you know that it's a 30-second piece. It's unjustified the amount of time and effort you put into that. And kind of thinking about that as a business, we would all spend, you said earlier, you could sit for hours and hours making it perfect. But as a business, you can't do that, especially if you've got a team of people that you're throwing at that project as well. And it's a case of you need someone to rein you in. So I think that's when I'm lucky that I've got my business partner being someone very businessy and not particularly creative to go, okay, the numbers don't work anymore, stop.
Yeah, need that balance.
To that as well, actually. I don't know if you guys get the same thing, but often creativity can be a bit overwhelming, and I don't know, I want to be creative with this, and I want to do this, and I want to do that. And often that can sometimes mean that I'm not doing anything at all. I'm like, I want to make the right decision, and I've got so many ideas that I kind of get frozen in one spot. So I think, letting it not get the better of you is obviously also something that's super important.
How do you normally get yourself unstuck?
I write them all down and, toss a coin.
Make a list.
Yeah, literally. I'm like, right, doing something's better than doing nothing at the end of the day. And I know that once I'm in the project and I'm doing it and there's some, things, there's momentum, things are moving, then I'm happy. But yeah, sometimes I do get a bit stuck.
Would you say as well that one would be your hindrance? Or
yes.
is that also like the blessing?
For sure. Creativity-wise, I come back to the same point again. The plus is that I'm my target market. I'm excited about what I do because I would be the one listening to it. So yeah.
Will that still apply in 10 years?
I would think so. I would think so. Because what a lot of what I do is based off nostalgia. So that's excuse the pun, but a bit like timeless. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Sarah?
I think it's so interesting what you're saying as well, because I think that there's different brain spaces to be in as well, and sometimes you get to be creative, and sometimes you need to do your accounting. Yeah. And it's so hard to switch between the two, and I think that's often why artists find it so hard to run businesses, because it's completely
got to wear a lot of
different.
Hats, right?
So many different hats, but it is just a whole different way of thinking. So being able to switch between the two is the challenge. And I think for me, obviously, we're kind of making games, right? We're making playful experiences where the whole point is we want to make it enticing, and it's kind of like using art and play as a Trojan horse to get people to talk about really difficult things or learn things that are boring, or kind of get people out and moving and exercising. And so it has to have that core creative element to it. One of my previous jobs, I used to work at the School of Life, got fired from the School of Life, which is probably like my favourite claim. But I remember the founder, Alain de Botton, he was like, we want to make philosophy and psychology shamelessly mainstream. And I always took that with me of like, how do we, and I think that's where the arts and play really can have a role in that as well. And so, yeah, that's very much at the core of what I do. And then thinking about more sustainable ways of it existing, and the whole arts on prescription thing that's now emerging more, of how you can go to your doctor and be prescribed singing classes, video games, VR, I find really exciting. And I think a big challenge as well at the moment that I'm really finding is like how these sorts of more interdisciplinary ways of working are supported, because we have a real identity crisis that Hatsumi and Deep and all these other things are startups, but we're also arts organisations. And so we have this mix of going to the Arts Council for funding, going to investors for funding. Last week we got to go to pitch our project at the Venice Biennale, which is like amazing. We got to go to this whole island dedicated to VR. It was insane. 75 VR experiences and just such a massive mix of people. But that we then had to kind of position ourselves as an arts company that exists in the film world, which is very different. I don't know if people know much about film, but the way that film works is that you have different production companies and you create these international co-productions, and then you get funding from Sweden and the UK and maybe Canada, and then you kind of all share this IP, which is really confusing when we're trying to be a startup as well. And so I think that we really need to start rethinking more ways of working where we are trying to dissolve the boundaries between arts, healthcare, startup, tech. But it does create a real challenge for us, and also opportunities to be funded in different ways. But like multi-dimensional accounting across multiple projects is making my head hurt. So hanging out here and having a beer and moaning about it is quite helpful. Therapy.
I think that's a bit of an age-old thing, is the siloed aspects of engineering, science, arts, and you know, how again do you get everyone to cross-pollinate, because there's really good stuff to happen there, but it's, age-old challenge, so good luck cracking that one.
Thanks.
Guys, thank you so much. Sara, Marcus, Ben and Sarah, please give them a big round of applause. Woo.